Okay, we're just going to let everyone have a few minutes to join us, but welcome everyone. Really lovely to see you all today for this, our October Wellbeing Hub monthly talk, and I'm absolutely delighted. I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Amy Pearson, who's going to be delivering a talk called Understanding Autistic Masking as a Response to Stigma. I'm just going to make a slow start to our preamble as people are logging in and arriving. Those of you who have been to our talks before, you will have heard some of this before, but welcome back if you're a regular to our monthly talks, and a very extra special welcome to those who are joining us for the first time tonight, and a really topical talk, I think, for World Mental Health Day. So welcome to everyone. Plan for tonight. First thing I'm going to do is just do a little introduction to the Wellbeing Hub and the team. We've got a bit of housekeeping to do, talk a bit about what the Wellbeing Hub does and what we have been doing over the past year since we launched last November. And then I'm going to hand over to Amy, who's going to talk for about 45 minutes or thereabouts, and then we'll have half an hour at the end for questions and discussion. But this evening's webinar will end at 8:30 promptly. Okay, so a little bit of extra information. Tonight's talk is being recorded, and everyone who has registered for the talk will receive a link to the video when it's uploaded to our YouTube channel. And we aim to do that within a couple of weeks of the talk, but typically we do manage to get that out a bit sooner. So yes, you will all be receiving a link to the recording. If you would like to ask Amy a question, about anything she talks about tonight, then please use the Q&A button. So you should be able to see that on your screen. It looks like the icon that I'm just showing you here in the slide. And for those of you who have been to our talks in the past, you may notice that there is a slight difference to the interface tonight. And that's because we've moved to a different version of Teams for our Wellbeing Hub talks. And you'll also notice that when you registered, you would have used Eventbrite to do it rather than the Teams webpage that you have used in the past. The reason for this is that this new version of Teams, this new kind of iteration of the platform, provides us with greater security, particularly around the recordings that we make. But it does mean, unfortunately, that we no longer have a separate Q&A and chat. They're kind of in the same thing. So it is going to be slightly different tonight. But if any of you have any problems whatsoever, or it's just not working right for you, then can you email us? It's autism@reading.ac.uk. We can't promise to fix the problem tonight, unfortunately. But if you do have any issues and you let us know, it's something that we can hopefully try to address for our talk next month and going forward. Amy is going to be dealing with the questions independently tonight. So she's going to be going through the chat and the Q&A as we discuss the content for tonight. So just feel free to ask questions as and when they arise, or indeed at the Q&A session at the end. But as I say, sometimes I pose the questions to the speaker, but Amy's going to be doing that herself. So do feel free to post a question whenever one occurs to you. We've got quite a big audience tonight, so it may be possible that Amy isn't able to answer all of the questions in the time that we have. So apologies to anyone out there who asks a question that we simply run out of time to answer, but we will do our very best to get through them all. In terms of the Wellbeing Hub team, they might be appearing on your screen right now. The way it's all set up for me at the moment is I'm not entirely sure, I can't see. But in addition to myself, as the researcher, we have Fiona Knott, who's our clinical director. We've also got Emma Harris, who's our clinical psychologist, and we also have Hazel McCarroll, who provides us with our executive admin support. So that's all of us, and they may be on the screen waving at you right now, but if not, this photograph. So in terms of the Wellbeing Hub, what do we do? So essentially we set up to bring some curiosity to the idea of what is autistic thriving, because we know a lot, certainly from a research perspective. We know a great deal about autistic distress. We know a great deal about autistic mental ill health and the challenges that autistic people face. But we know relatively little about autistic well-being, autistic flourishing, autistic thriving, what a good life means for an autistic person, particularly from the perspective of autistic people themselves. And this is really problematic, not only because, of course, it's important that we understand all of human experience, but it's particularly important that because when autistic people do experience distress and challenge, often the support that's out there is really modelled on what works best for non-autistic people. And we know very well that that doesn't always meet the needs of autistic people. So it's really important that we get this understanding of flourishing and thriving and a good life from the perspective of autistic people. And that's exactly what the Wellbeing Hub has been set up to do, is to, as I say, bring some curiosity to that idea. And the way that we do that is to place autistic people at the heart of everything we do. And we have the aim of building an inclusive community of autistic people and their allies to work together to find creative and meaningful solutions to the challenges that autistic people tell us are creating difficulties in their lives. But with the aim of really supporting this idea of flourishing and leading your best life. And what have we been doing over this past year since we set up? Well, we've been running these monthly talks, which have been really popular, all on the theme of autistic thriving, all led by autistic people or their allies. We've also been running a termly in-person special interest group for professionals based here at the university campus, with the aim of sharing best neurodiversity affirming practice. We've also been doing a range of projects within local schools and setting up projects to support families. And also Emma, our clinical psychologist, is leading on doing some direct work with autistic young people aimed at increasing their sense of autonomy and agency and authenticity. But everything we do is also about training clinicians of the future. So our project is supported by our master's placement students. So again, thinking about how can we develop their understanding of neurodiversity affirming approaches that they can take into their career as they move forward. And everything we do, we're trying to document as much of it as we can to make a meaningful contribution to research. And if you want to know more about what we're doing, the projects that we're setting up, we're moving quite quickly. It's a very organic process, but things seem to change every month. So if you want to find out about those, then please do sign up to our newsletter. You can do that by emailing autism at Reading, excuse me, at reading.ac.uk. You can also find out about our monthly talks. Our next talk is going to be on the 14th of November, again, 7 till 8:30 p.m. on Teams. And we actually have a member of the University of Reading family who's going to be delivering that talk. That's Professor Alain Leville, who's our Pro Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Inclusion and a late diagnosed autistic man. He's going to be talking about making your own kind of music, a reflection on being autistic and navigating life. And that you can sign up for that. The newsletter is going out next week, and that will have a link where you can sign up for it. All of our previous talks, well, in fact, not all of them, because some of our speakers would prefer not to have their talks recorded or have them recorded but not available forever and ever. So some of our previous talks, those that we have permission to use, are on our YouTube channel, and I will put a link in the Q&A, which has all of the links that you need to find our pages. And a bit of shameless self-promotion as well. I'm delivering a talk for the CRAE webinar on the 14th of November about my research with autistic young adults looking back on their primary school experiences. So I'll put a link in the chat for that. But we're all here tonight to listen to Amy, so let's bring the focus back to tonight. So Dr. Amy Pearson is an assistant professor in psychology at Durham University, and she's part of the Centre for Neurodiversity and Development. She's a late diagnosed autistic adult, and her research focuses on understanding autistic identity, masking, and victimization. She's also the co-author of an amazing book called Autistic Masking. And again, I'll put a link to that in the chat. So over to you, Amy.
Thank you so much, Jo. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay now. I will also shamelessly plug Jo's talk because I have had the absolute privilege of hearing about this wonderful work and would thoroughly recommend that everyone goes and listens to that because it's brilliant. So I am going to share my slides with you. Let me find the window. It's this one. And I'm going to go full screen on that and then hopefully be able to pop this little Teams box back open because it sometimes helped me to feel like I'm talking to people instead of just talking to an empty screen. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about understanding autistic masking as a response to stigma. And I'll start off by saying you can probably guess from the title of the talk that this might get a little bit bleak at times. So I'm going to talk about kind of garden variety stigma, dehumanization, and a bit about the history of autism and eugenics towards the start of the talk. So just a little warning to take care of yourself. And if anything makes you feel uncomfortable, please do what you need to do to make sure that you feel safe. These are not pleasant topics, but they are really important, I think, for us to talk about them openly. So without further ado, as Jo said, I am an autistic researcher. So I was late diagnosed, late identified in my early 30s. So I come from a lived experience perspective. But interestingly, I was an autism researcher before I knew I was an autistic person. So I've had a bit of a weird journey and a roundabout journey to get where I am now. I tend to take a neurodiversity perspective with my work. And what I mean by that is that I see autism and other forms of neurodivergence like ADHD, dyslexia, PTSD, bipolar as value neutral differences. People who experience neurodivergence might classify themselves as experiencing impairment or significant challenges. They might also see significant strengths in their own experiences. But importantly, none of these things make neurodivergent people lesser or more superior than anyone else. It's a value neutral difference. That means that we can take a non-pathologizing approach. We can provide support for people without having to treat us like we're worth less. And I'm also a really big fan of a participatory research approach, which means that I like to work with other autistic and neurodivergent people where possible. I like to design research with other people. I like to plan projects and carry out research in collaboration with other neurodivergent academics and non-academics. And I like to share power with the people I work with. So working as much as I can in a really non-hierarchical way where we share thoughts and we work together to try and create research that improves the community that we're part of. It's really important for me as an autistic person that the work that I do is of benefit to other autistic people and that we try and address community priorities with the work that we do. It's absolutely crucial that we try and improve outcomes for autistic people. They're absolutely abysmal. As Jo was saying at the beginning, we know autistic people have poorer mental health, higher rates of suicidality. A lot of my own work focuses on experiences of victimization. And we really need to be able to prevent these outcomes. So I'm going to talk about stigma. I was going to do a nice little introduction where I got you all to do a little bit of an exercise, but seeing as I can't see any of you, I'm going to skip straight through to just kind of talking about neurodiversity. So as I've said, I view neurodiversity as a value neutral difference. And for those of you, most of you are probably very intimately familiar with the concept of neurodiversity by now, but just a little whirlwind tour in case you're not. The idea of neurodiversity is a community idea. So the term itself is often attributed to Judy Singer, but the concept of neurodiversity is attributable to many other people. And it's the idea that there are differences we see across humans that manifest in different ways of thinking, of moving, of paying attention to things in the world around us, and that these things represent similar differences to what we see within nature with regards to biodiversity. So all of the images on the screen are of different flowers. If I asked you to think of a flower, you would probably think of something like a cosmo, a daisy, a rose, that archetypal idea of what a flower looks like. But all of these things here are also flowers. They're no less flowery just because they're less common or less stereotypical. So the concept of neurodiversity really encapsulates the idea that we see so much variation across different kinds of humans with regards to how we think and process information, and that none of us are more or less human. We just do things in very different ways. And this idea of neurodiversity has started to shift our approach as psychologists away from a very pathologizing understanding of difference to one that's a little bit more inclusive. So, historically, our understanding of autism and other forms of neurodivergence has come from a medical model approach. So the medical model tends to see collections of traits or characteristics as something that we group together to form a diagnosis. And these collections might be diseases, disorders, conditions. But the idea of these collections of characteristics as diagnosable takes what we call a curative or a normative approach. So we think of it as something that is wrong and that we need to fix. So something that we need to remediate. And it's very much grounded in the idea that we can see different characteristics, that these things are externally visible and that they form a category that we tend to think of as abnormal. Now, we've seen a shift towards a social model of disability with many forms of difference. So with neurodiversity, but also with other disabilities. And this work came from disability justice. And effectively, the social model took the idea that impairment is situated within the person and said, hang on a minute, impairment is an interaction. So you might be disabled, but you only experience impairment when you're in situations where there are barriers outside of you that prevent you from living your life in a fluid manner. So the idea that impairment lies with things that impose restrictions on disabled people. For people who use a wheelchair, this could be not having a ramp in a building. For people who struggle with being overwhelmed with sensory information, this might not be able to be using sensory devices like noise cancelling headphones when you're in a really busy environment. So the social model takes into account that relationship between an individual person's difficulties and the environment around us. And this can be really useful for understanding the experiences of neurodivergent people, disabled people, and autistic people in particular. So, what do we know about autism? The history of autism is really bleak, but it's really important, I think, for understanding how stigma impacts on us. So, autism has what we often refer to as a bit of a twin history, in that the formulation of autism as a category happened in the 1940s in Nazi-occupied Austria and in the US at around the same time from two distinct researchers, so Hans Asperger and Leo Kanner. There's been a lot of discussion as to whether Kanner plagiarized some of Asperger's ideas. And likewise, there's been discussion of whether both of them plagiarized Green Yusuchareva, who was writing about autistic characteristics back in the 1920s. But Asperger's work, I think in particular, is really important for situating those early conceptualizations of autistic people. Asperger's work involved deciding which children under Action T4 in Nazi-occupied Austria at the time was which children were seen as capable, as educable, and worthy of taking care of, and which children were seen as disposable lives. So at the time, children with disabilities were being sorted into who was seen as contributing to society and who was seen as unworthy of contributing to society. And that was crucial because the children who were seen as incapable of contributing to society were sent to special children's hospitals, where many of them were euthanized. So around 900 children were euthanized during the 40s under Action T4. And so Asperger was seen as a little bit of a hero for a short time, that he was maybe saving a group of children who he characterized as having rigid behaviors and struggling with social interaction, having sensory differences, but also having intellect, meaning that they might be capable of contributing towards the world that they wanted to build. And so Asperger's early work from that earliest point was about sorting not just normal from abnormal, but within that category of abnormal, who was seen as worthwhile and who wasn't. Leo Kanner's work took a slightly more empathic approach, so he really cared for the children that he worked with, and he came across a small case study or collection of children, 11 kids, that had very similar characteristics. So again, were struggling with social interaction, preferred to engage in their own interests. And so if you haven't read Kanner's original case studies, I would thoroughly recommend it because they're really interesting. And they're also retrospectively quite hilarious, because he talks about the families in such detail, and he's saying, the children are really rigid, they have these really strong interests, their parents have these really high-powered jobs, and they have such rigid interests. The children are just like the parents. It must be because of their parenting styles. Nowadays, we can recognize this as autistic parents having autistic children. But at the time, that's not really the approach that was taken. So, from those early days, autism has been seen as deficit, as impairment, and as abnormality. And in the 1980s, Lorna Wing and Judith Gold kind of took these key categories of impairment and pull them together to form what's called the triad of impairments. So the idea that autism can be categorized by three distinct impairments in social interaction, social communication, and social imagination. Now, I know social interaction and social communication sound exactly the same, but these are effectively just getting at language differences and non-language differences. So things like gesture and the use of facial expression. And that's how we've thought about autism as up until fairly recently, that autistic people are primarily characterized by impairments. And this led to a spate of research trying to understand our cognitive differences, our lack of understanding of other minds, our lack of interest in people, our lack of empathy. That is really, for the majority of psychological research, led to an idea of autistic people as deficient in many, many things. So we've thought of autistic people as impaired, as deficient, and we've seen that as a problem. We haven't really thought of autistic people as whole people. So what on earth is autism really?
Amy,
It's
sorry to
yes,
interrupt you. Beg
yeah,
your pardon. Just before you move on to this next slide, I just want to say that for us, we can't see all of your slide is only very small in the corner of the screen rather than it being
right.
full screen. I just wondered if you might be able to have a look. You can zoom in, by the way, everyone. If you go down to where Amy's name is at the bottom of the screen, there is a plus and minus sign, so you can zoom in and out. But I just wondered, Amy, if it might be worth stopping your screen,
Just stop
resharing
them
and
and then
seeing if
resharing
That,
it.
sorry, I'm interrupting that. I've done the clicking and it actually makes it full screen for me, and then I've still got Amy's
Oh,
picture on one side. So it may be that's a quick fix,
thanks.
hopefully.
do you want me to stop and see if that makes a difference? It's full screen on my screen, like it's filling
Yeah.
the whole thing.
Just want to check with the audience if you could let us know in the discussion in the Q&A if using the arrows, the plus and minus arrows are helping, or would you like us to reshare? I know there's a little bit of a delay with this version of Teams, so it might be 10 seconds or so before we get a reply. I think if you want to carry on, Amy, and we'll just
Okay.
use the Zoom features, apologies. And if it is a problem, if you don't mind, I might just pop in next time you pause between slides.
That's fine. I've got you open so I can still see you and I can see the chat as well. Um,
Thanks, Amy. Thank you.
yeah, hopefully that helps.
Thanks.
So we'll quickly move on to what autism is. And there's no set answer to this. So there's still a lot of disagreement, I think, within the community, within research. But we tend to think of autism, instead of being characterized by a triad of impairments, as representing differences to what we think of as the neurotypical population across a range of domains. So if I use myself as an example with each of these, I might say that in terms of my language skills, well, obviously I can use spoken language to communicate. I'm very verbose. I make quite a lot of eye contact, but I'm absolutely rubbish at small talk. And I tend to interrupt people in conversation because I can't tell where the gaps are. I'm quite good at picking up on etiquette, though I'm not really bothered about taboo, and I can maintain and form relationships quite well. I'm very monotropic, which is great. I have a job where I can focus on a topic that I'm really passionate about. Academia is great for that. And I have difficulty moving from one task to another. I can process new information quite quickly and adapt well to new environments, but change does make me feel incredibly anxious. And I can deal with change more or less well, depending on how stressed I am in other aspects of my life. I experience hyper and hyposensitivity. So sometimes sensory stimulation seems like too much. That might be smell or it might be noise. But I find touch something that I'm quite hyposensitive to. So I prefer kind of hard pressure as opposed to light. I do tend to stim, which, I do quite subtle small movements. Some people do full body rocking movements, turn in circles. And lots of us experience neuromotor differences. I'm a little bit clumsy. Some people struggle to move with intention. Some neurodivergent people experience grace, which I think is really nice for them. So Olympic athlete Simone Biles is not autistic, but she has ADHD. And she obviously has incredible proprioception, but most of us just don't get that. So autism is not limited to impairment. It manifests in differences in how we process a range of information and how we experience the world in general. And when we talk about autistic people, that early idea of Asperger's, that we could sort autistic people into groups of contributors and people who are less worthwhile, led to this idea of more or less autistic. The idea that maybe if you use spoken language to communicate and you need less support with your daily living, you're less autistic. And if you don't use spoken language and you need a lot of help, you're more autistic. And really, this doesn't recognize the fluctuation we see among autistic people based on our individual circumstances, how stressed we are. Some people experience selective mutism or losing the ability to use language in conversation. Some people never develop the ability to use spoken language, but actually don't need as much support with their daily living, can live quite independently. So sorting autistic people on the basis of these really rigid categories doesn't really describe us particularly well at all. So we think
Sorry,
of,
Amy.
yeah,
I'm so sorry to interrupt you again.
that's
Unfortunately,
okay.
people aren't able to zoom in and out, and we're getting lots of messages from people that they just can't read the slides, they're too small. So I just wondered if you could unshare your slides
Yeah,
and then reshare them again, and
and then
hopefully
reshare.
that might solve the problem.
Okay,
And apologies again for interrupting.
that's all right. Let's see if this makes a difference. Hang on, is it this one? Okay. Can you
Still
see
showing.
that?
Yeah, that's still showing as a very small section of the screen.
So bizarre. Right.
Do you want to email them to me and I'll share and I can do next slide and so on?
Yeah, I think that might be. Oh, hang on. Will this.
That's better. There we go.
Is that better? Has that
That's
worked?
worked. That's worked for me. I don't know
Okay.
if anyone can let us know in the chat, but that definitely is that's working. That's full screen for me.
Fantastic. So I've shared the screen instead of the slides, and hopefully that'll be clearer.
Thank you. Hopefully I won't interrupt you again, Amy. Sorry about that.
That's absolutely fine.
Thanks.
Hopefully that's okay. Just checking the chat to see if that's resolved it for people. Hopefully it has. Fingers crossed, but I'll keep a little eye on that just in case. So thankfully my slides are mostly just pictures that are there as prompts for me to remind me what I'm going to say. So we think of autism as a minority neurotype. We think of neurotypicality, or the idea that there is kind of a default or a normal kind of human. That is something I won't go into detail today because I could talk about that till for a very, very long time. The idea that we do actually have a representative human. I always say it's a little bit like, taking all of us and taking our shoe sizes and then buying us all a pair of shoes based on the average shoe size. Those shoes probably aren't going to fit many of us very well. So the idea that there is an average kind of brain or an average kind of way of thinking probably doesn't represent those individual differences either. But for the majority of people who don't seem to struggle in society with the same things that we do, we tend to think of these people as neurotypical or as the dominant neurotype or representing the dominant culture. And neurominorities like autistic people differ from this. So our views of autistic people have started to shift away from that very medicalized, very deficit focused model to a more neurodiversity affirming approach. But the ability to control this narrative about autistic people is not often handed to autistic people to shape. So it's still that shaping of the narrative. Most of the power to do that is with researchers, it's with clinicians, it's with practitioners and teachers and politicians. It isn't often handed to people in the community. And a lot of this is based on the idea of power knowledge dynamics. So Foucault talked about the idea that abnormal people, people who are thought of as abnormal, are often seen as unable to create knowledge about themselves. We're seen as incredible witnesses, meaning we lack credibility to talk about our own experiences. And so we're not really seen as believable or worth listening to. And we've definitely seen this in research. There's been up until the past 10 years, really, there was a lack of qualitative research about autistic people. There was a lack of listening to autistic people when we designed studies, when we conducted research, because we thought autistic people didn't have insights into our own experiences, that we didn't have any self-reflection skills. And so why would you ask someone if you didn't think they could reflect on it? So all of this has led to a primarily dehumanizing narrative about autistic people within autism research and also within the wider world. So the ideas that we have as researchers pervade public consciousness, right? So with the way the public think about autism is primarily driven by the narratives that we create. And autistic experiences tend to be pathologized and othered. So we're treated like there's something wrong with us. We're reduced to very medicalized descriptions of traits and characteristics, our lack of eye contact, our lack of empathy, our challenging behaviours, rather than thinking about the humans that we're describing. And autistic people lack the power to change that. We make up a minority in society. We also make up a minority in the research community. And though we have some absolutely amazing allies, I often say I live within a bit of a bubble because I primarily work with other really neurodiversity affirming researchers. And then I go to big conferences where I'm surrounded by people who think that people like me shouldn't exist. Which is a really awkward position to be in. So Monique Botha highlights how autistic people in autism research are frequently presented with dehumanizing and stigmatizing ideas of our own identities. We constantly have to read and engage with narratives that situate us as having something wrong with us. So this experience of dehumanization is intimately linked with stigma. So Lincoln Phelan proposed that stigma is attributed over 4 different steps. So we see individual differences in other people and we compare them to ourselves. We take their characteristics and we compare them to us and we label these characteristics and we assign them as positive or negative. And then we form stereotypes based on the dominant norms. So if we're part of the dominant group and we see people who act differently to us, we think everyone who is in that group is going to act like that. And we start to form a negative stereotype based on that information. We then start building on that and categorizing other people within those groups to create an in-group, out-group distinction. So we're not like them and they're not like us. And then importantly, the out-group status is diminished. And this often leads to poor outcomes for people in the out-group. Now, this can only happen if the in-group has societal power. So if they're in that dominant position. There's a really interesting example of this in their work where they talk about institutionalization and people who are in mental health institutions. And they say that the groups of people in these hospitals might refer to the staff as rubber healers. So it's like an in-joke about the kind of shoes that the staff wear. But those people who are in the institution have absolutely no power to affect the lives of the staff. Whereas the staff, if they dehumanize or stereotype the patients, call them lunatics, say that they're mental, they have the power to impact their lives. They can prevent them from experiencing freedom, of agency, of having any choice about their own lives. It can impact on whether they're able to go home to their families. And so the power that comes along with that dominant role dictates how much your stigma has an impact on somebody. So I've compared this to recent discussions around autistic people and autism researchers because there's a lot of defensiveness, I think, sometimes from researchers when we talk about a dehumanizing approach. And they'll say, well, those autistic people are just so horrible about the lovely work that I've tried to do. and it makes me feel really uncomfortable and sad, and like they're pushing me out of my career. Well, actually, autistic people don't really have the power to push you out of your career, but you do have the power to shape the narrative that's going to dictate the kinds of services that people have access to, how education is structured, whether people have access to good forms of therapy. All of that comes from researchers. They can't really do very much to you aside from individually offend you. Stigma needs power to actually have an impact. So autistic people are stigmatized at the group level. So as a group, we think of autistic people as impaired, as deficient, but we also experience stigma at the individual level for failing to meet normative expectations. So we might, as individuals, be labelled weird, or I used to love the term a freak when I was in school. We get told as individuals that there's something wrong with us and how we are. And that can also lead to the internalization of that stigma, where we start to believe that there is something wrong with us. And I'll come on to that a little bit further on and start to talk about masking. But even the way we talk about autistic interests, passions, they're described as circumscribed and restricted as niche. When autistic people perform similarly to non-autistic people on cognitive tasks, we're told that our performance is compensatory or that it's intact, like it's a surprise that we can do these things. So even these really simple ways of talking about people can lead to a dehumanizing and stigmatizing approach. And it's really important to understand how stigma pervades before we move on to talk about the relationship between stigma and masking. So stigma perpetuates through things like stereotypes, through prejudicial action, and through discrimination. And the experience of stigma can often manifest in an increase in stressful or negative life events. So things like social exclusion, like job loss or difficulty getting a job, things like homelessness, the experience of everyday discrimination or expectations of rejection, stigma management and concealment or masking, and internalized stigma. So taking the idea that there's something wrong with you or people like you and taking that into your own self-concept. And as a response to stigma, you can try and cope with that and develop support strategies. You can also try and create meaning out of your experiences. And these can lead to both positive and negative outcomes. So the negative outcomes are everything you would expect: poor mental health, difficulty with relationships, difficulty with job performance. But we also see positive outcomes from stigma, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So meeting other people who are like you and forming a positive marginalized identity, engaging in advocacy and social creativity, attempting to drive social change, like the work that the Wellbeing Hub's doing, trying to change things for the better, taking those ideas and really flipping them on their head. So before I talk about masking, I just want to talk about internalized stigma for a moment, because this feeds into that idea of masking and projecting a different version of yourself. When we talk about stigma, we take the idea that it makes you think of yourself in a negative manner. But actually, stigma can manifest in quite subtle ways sometimes. So I'm sure some of you have heard of the concept already of Aspie supremacy, but we also have a term that's used in the disability literature more broadly, which is the supercrip. So instead of just internalizing the idea that there's something wrong with you or people like you internalize the idea that there's something wrong with people who have a similar characteristic to you, and then you try and distance yourself from that characteristic. So people who think of, okay, well, I've been diagnosed as autistic, but I'm super intelligent. I've always been told that I'm really smart, or, well, I did really well at school, so I'm not like these other people. Or I have a really good understanding of systems. It's just people. Like, it doesn't matter. That's not important. No one cares about that. So kind of internalizing that idea that you need to be better than other people in order to be worth the same. Just still a form of stigma. It just manifests in a really different manner. And we see this in the way that autistic people are represented in the media as well. So we don't often see very mediocre autistic people, as most of us are. We're just regular people. We don't have superpowers. We don't all have eidetic memories or photographic memories. We're not superheroes. We're just regular people. We don't have to have those characteristics in order to make us worthwhile. But that internalized stigma can sometimes lead us to feeling like we do need to be more in order to be worth the same. Now, some of the issues that I'm going to describe come down to the double empathy problem. So the double empathy problem There's a theory proposed by Dr. Damien Milton, who is an autistic scholar of many different areas, who does absolutely phenomenal work. And he talks about dispositional diversity between autistic and non-autistic people, though this would be relevant to any two groups of people who have different life experiences or think differently. And this is the idea that we're all experts in our own communication style. So as we grow up, we learn how to communicate with people, and we tend to process information from people who communicate in the same way as us more effectively and more efficiently, which leads us to label these people as more likable as well. We find it really difficult when people don't communicate in the same way as us. It's not something our brains pick up on really easily. Now, we know that autistic people do struggle to communicate sometimes with non-autistic people, but we also see difficulties for non-autistic people communicating with autistic people. And there's some evidence to support this from Catherine Crompton and colleagues who used diffusion chains, so passing a message from one person to another, and found that groups of all autistic people were as effective as transmitting information to each other as groups of all neurotypical people. When you had mixed groups of autistic to non-autistic person, that's where we see a little breakdown in communication. We also know that non-autistic people are more likely to make negative social judgments about autistic people based on facial information, on information from the voice. And this suggests that there's something about the way we move, about the way they look, how we communicate, that can make non-autistic people feel uncomfortable, a bit of an uncanny valley effect. So, this experience of being treated as other, has been dehumanized, has been seen as lesser, and had these negative social judgments leads expectedly on to feeling like you need to suppress aspects of yourself and your identity or project a different profile of a person to outsiders in order to fit in or to avoid stigma. So there are lots of different names for masking. Some researchers use camouflaging. When Lawson proposed adaptive morphing, so thinking about it like a chameleon, uses for safety. Non-native cognitive routes are referred to as compensation, which is a term I really don't like because I feel like it inherently sets up like you're having to make up for something. But it is really important to recognize that sometimes we do use non-native strategies in order to complete a task. So Kieran Rose and I define masking as consciously or unconsciously suppressing aspects of self and identity or projecting an expected profile to outsiders. And that idea of projecting acceptability is something that's also really important to think about. Masking isn't just hiding aspects of yourself, but it's also portraying a non-authentic version of yourself to other people. Masking might be motivated by social affiliation. So some people have talked about masking as a strategy they use to blend in or fit in or make friends. But a lot of autistic people have described masking as something they do to stay safe or to survive. So in my own research around the experiences of autistic people who've been victimized by people that they know, they often talk about masking being motivated by quite traumatic social experiences early on in life, of being treated badly by other people and needing to feel like they need to suppress themselves or be someone else in order to avoid further harm. And to this end, masking does appear to be developmental in nature. So we're starting to see research emerging showing that masking begins in childhood, often again motivated by experiences with peers, with school teachers, and continues across the lifespan. So it might start off as a coping mechanism to deal with these really difficult situations, and it's something that over time becomes internalized and becomes quite unconscious for many people. So people might be aware that they do it, but they don't necessarily have it under conscious control in individual situations. An example of this I can give you that I do, and I know other people have experienced as well, is that I tend to talk differently depending on who I'm speaking to. So when I'm presenting to an audience, I tend to use my what I think is a more of a neutral accent. If I'm talking to other people from the Northeast, I have a much broader accent. If I meet someone who is from another country, I have to work really hard not to mimic the way in which they speak, because just picking up on someone's tone of voice and the way in which they kind of change their prosody is something that I start to do as well. And it makes me really uncomfortable because it sounds like I'm taking the mick, but it's not something that I can consciously control. It just happens. So a lot of the research around masking originally emerged with regards to looking at gender disparity. And this continues to kind of be a bit of a prevailing narrative about masking, that masking is something that autistic girls do or autistic women do. That means that we go hidden and we go unseen. And It is important to take gender into account when we think about masking and when we think about identity, but it's not quite as simple as saying girls mask more than boys. So we know there are diagnostic disparities between males and females. That gap seems to be closing and now getting around 2 to 1. That's not even in taking into account the number of people that don't sit within that gender binary. So the research into this is really in its infancy. But the explanations for that gender disparity, there have been a variety put forward. So the idea that autistic girls have a protective effect, that somehow we need a higher genetic hit of autism. Don't quite know how that works, but somehow we need more genetic autism there in order for that to be expressed. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying that, but it's about as ridiculous as it sounds. A closer explanation of the autism the female phenotype, saying effectively that we see different characteristics in autistic women, which comes a little bit closer to forming an explanation, but I think is still very oversimplified. Autistic women and girls do not have a different kind of autism, but we might have different experiences that lead us to present in ways that are different to autistic boys because we're not boys. So we might have different socialized interests. We might express our feelings in different ways. We might have different ways of showing our emotions or interacting with other people. And that's not because it's a different kind of autism. All of our experiences and our identities are shaped by the different characteristics we have. That includes our gender, but it also includes things like our socioeconomic status, our upbringing, our culture, our race or ethnicity, all of the things that make us us. And we can't break autism down into little categories where we say, okay, well, there's autism, that's what boys have, and then there's female autism. Oh, but do we need white female autism and black female autism? What about gay autism? Like, it's ridiculous to try and split things out like that. Autistic people differ from each other because we're human and we have individual differences. But we do know that autistic people, as a response to those social situations in which we feel uncomfortable, sometimes feel like we need to mask our autistic characteristics, or that we need to try and portray a different version of ourselves, and that interacts with our gendered experience. So the thing that makes this difficult is that autism doesn't just look like one thing. So often when we're trying to explain why girls go underdiagnosed, they'll say, well, she had really normative interests, she was interested in pop music. Yeah, but to what degree was she interested in pop music? Like, did she know every single K-pop band and every single song and have all of the merchandise lined up very neatly in her bedroom? How is that any different to having an interest in trains and lining trains up or lining cars? The degree of passion towards that interest is a better indicator than the interest itself. I always say it's like saying a neurotypical person can't be neurotypical if they like cycling instead of going to the pub. We would never say that because it's absolutely ludicrous. And yet you hear about autistic people being told, oh, well, you can't be autistic because you don't like trains or dinosaurs. And like trains and dinosaurs are great, but not all autistic people are going to be interested in those. So some autistic people don't fit with stereotype, and that doesn't mean they're masking. And some autistic people don't fit with stereotype, and they are masking. Those two things are not always the same. Just keeping one eye on the chat here as well. There's some really great questions coming up. I will answer these in a little bit. So autistic social skills are different from those of non-autistic people. And the way in which we communicate with each other can sometimes differ. And learning non-native skills is a little bit like learning another language. You can use this to communicate with other people. But if that's under your own agency, it's under your control, that's a lot more comfortable than feeling like you have to engage in those things in order to make you feel safe. And being told that the language or the communication style of the other group is superior to the one that you naturally use. So sometimes masking can allow people to conserve energy. Here I've used the example of children and young people, but it's the same for adults when moving between different contexts, like school and home or work and home. You might kind of put on different hats in different social situations in order to conserve a bit of energy, in order to appear more professional. And that's something that everybody does. So everybody switches themselves through different contexts, letting different bits of themselves maybe shine a little more or dim a little more. Not everyone has that experience of feeling like they're inauthentic in those situations because not everyone experiences that stigma. So what can masking look like? This is a non-exhaustive list. It includes different behavioral aspects, so things like exaggerating your personality or dumbing down your personality a little bit. It can be people pleasing, so trying to keep everybody else happy so that no one hurts you. Look like conforming. You've got linguistic forms of masking. So again, things like mimicking people's tone of voice, mirroring the kinds of language that people use. Directed hyperlexia is an interesting one. So saying lots of things that sound really smart, but actually there not being very much content in there and using that to hide behind a little bit. You can change your appearance. That's it's a very basic strategy that many people use to mask and to make good impressions. So change the kind of clothes that you wear, change where you sit and stand. And there are also lots of physical, mental, and emotional things that we change. So suppressing our emotions, suppressing sensory distress, acting like we're not in pain. It's also common among people who have chronic illness. Suppressing how exhausted you are. And the outcomes from this are pretty dire. So we know that autistic people are more likely to experience victimization, and more likely to become incredibly burnt out, and are more likely to experience mental health difficulties. So there's a question in the chat that asks, how do you know if you're masking? And I'm going to talk about this briefly now with regards to children and young people, but this is also relevant to adults. It's just a little hard usually to tell. With children and young people, one of the key things that we often hear from parents and from educators is that there's a difference between how a child appears in different environments. So home and school are usually the most key examples, that when the child is at school, they're so well behaved, they don't appear to struggle, they're absolutely fine. And then they leave school and they absolutely melt down, explode, can't hold their feelings in anymore. Or they become really, really withdrawn and shut down and have to go and be by themselves and can't interact with anyone as soon as they leave that school environment. And being able to notice that switch between those different places is usually key, that something's being going on in one of those environments. Usually the child is suppressing themselves at school, trying not to have a response to things, and then they let that out when they get somewhere where they feel safe, which is their home environment. But we see similar things with adults who talk about their experiences with work, having to be switched on at work all day and coming home and having to take a lie down in a darkened room, for example, or feeling they're melting down, or really struggling with, losing their temper at the flip of a switch. I used to say that I would be very stressed. I would feel like I was a constant, just like a pan that was about to boil over, just a pan that was always on simmer. And then the smallest thing would completely make me lose my temper. And it would always be a noise. It would be like the metro was slightly too loud or it was 2 minutes late. And that would be it. My day would be immeasurably ruined. And it would always seem like it was a small thing rather than that build up of suppression that tips you over the edge. So in some research that we did with autistic people back in 2021, we found that masking was really all-encompassing, that it had some external manifestations, so changing things like how you look, talking about different interests with different people, but that for most people, masking was life. It was something that led to a complete loss of self and difficulty knowing where you started and where the mask ended, which was really draining for people. So it led to a huge physical and emotional toll. People felt really burnt out, felt really drained most of the time. And there were some things that were really specific to autistic people that we didn't see in other groups. So hiding sensory issues, for example, or using your memory to try and appear like you're really engaged with someone. And that this led to no one believing you when you're really struggling with things. So there's external consequences. But it also prevented people from making connections with others, from forming meaningful relationships because they felt like people didn't really know them. And people felt like masking was the language of neurotypicals, tapping into that idea that we all change our impressions and our contexts tend to dictate how we appear. But when the stakes are higher, that is, when you're stigmatized more, there's that stronger external influence on you to change yourself in order to fit in. And that this happens over time, so it becomes unconscious, but it also becomes harder with age. And for some people over time, as they got older, they also started to care less what other people thought, and it got a little bit easier to be authentic. And this is crucial because, as I said, masking impacts on mental health in a dire way. We know it's related to anxiety and depression, suicidality, and heightened risk of autistic burnout. But it isn't always safe for autistic people to unmask, and it isn't easy for autistic people to unmask either. So, safety is a crucial factor in being able to unmask or explore your authentic self. Some autistic people cannot move through the world authentically for fear of what will happen to them. So Melissa Simmons has talked about this. There's also some really great blogs out there. Fidgets and Fries, Tiffany Hammond's written about this. Many Black autistic people do not feel like it is safe to unmask, and the stakes for them are very, very high. We have seen cases in the US where young Black autistic people have been shot and killed for stimming in public, for appearing to be different to other people. And so when we talk about masking and safety and that impact that stigma has, we also have to think about this as an intersectional issue. It's not safe for all autistic people to unmask. So until it's safe for everyone, we need to fight like hell to reduce stigma, not just towards autistic people, but also towards people from racialized minorities, from people from sex and gender minorities. We need to make sure all autistic people feel safe. I'm going to skip over this for a moment because I think this is probably a little bit modular for this talk, but effectively, when we talk about masking, we start to talk about authenticity. People will often say, how do you unmask? How do you become your authentic self? And it's not quite as straightforward as that. When you've had a lifetime of trauma and internalized stigma, you can't just take something off your face and put it down. It's in your entire person. It's a long process of picking that apart. And one of the things that Kieran and I say really makes masking differ from general impression management or generally changing who you are in different contexts, putting those hats on and taking them off, is that the experience of stigma doesn't lead to changes in the value expression of how much you show of yourself, but it leads to suppression or protection of an inauthentic version of you. That you feel like only people can see these characteristics because they are what keeps you safe, rather than just multifaceted aspects of yourself. So in terms of thinking about how we might support autistic people more effectively throughout that process of unmasking and also to mask a little bit less, we need to think about providing more effective environmental support for people. And this can help with things like recognizing feelings. So a lot of autistic people struggle with recognizing emotional states. Alexithymia is common in around 50 to 60% of autistic people. So we struggle to recognize our own emotions. And we also experience a lot of invalidation for how we process information. So we'll often get told, stop being fussy when people won't eat food because the texture is really unappealing to them. Or I can't hear anything if you're saying you hear a noise that other people don't. And that interaction between struggling to identify what's going on internally for yourself and then being told that your idea of identifying that is wrong often leads people to suppress their responses even more. And it can lead to difficulties in responding to things like therapeutic support, so not knowing how you feel when someone asks you, and an inability to identify your emotions is maybe something you don't realize that other people experience. You just push things down because that's the way you feel safe. And having access to the right kinds of language to describe your experiences can make a massive difference. So when people are constantly masking responses to distress, to what's going on around us, it can make it even more difficult to recognize your own emotions. And as I was saying before, if you're experiencing that constant buildup of stress and then suddenly you seem like you're losing your temper, it's because you can't regulate stress if you can't recognize it happening. And if you're constantly having to mask and push things down, you're not necessarily going to recognize that buildup. So there are strategies that you might form that might help you to kind of start working out when you are masking. So are you seeming to have those really kind of immediate responses to things that are actually building up over time? Can you start linking that back to what was going on? For kids, is it that they've got a particularly busy day at school, or they always have PE on a Wednesday? They've got to interact with everyone. They've got to go into that busy kind of changing room with everybody else. There's that constant shift from classroom to task. and helping to link when that happens with when you start to feel really distressed can help you start to recognize masking and also think about strategies that you can put in place to try and mitigate that. Because a lack of responsiveness to support and a lack of responsiveness to intervention doesn't necessarily mean someone isn't engaging. So a lot of autistic people might not have the right language to describe our experiences. Our needs might not be met. We might be really focused on things and struggle to move from one thing to another. And that masking might help us to get through that. We also know a lot of people can be experiencing quite complex trauma alongside neurodivergence, which can appear to manifest with quite a lot of complexity. And this leads to us often being labelled as non-compliant, as being really challenging. And if the only way to deal with that is to mask, it's not necessarily going to have a more positive impact. So working with autistic people through a really humanistic lens, through a really humanizing lens, can avoid further trauma, and also trying to take that more compassionate approach to ourselves can also be really helpful. So I'm going to leave you on this, which is that what you see isn't always what you get. People in extreme distress don't always look like that from the outside. And trying to look past what you see, whether that's to other people or internally, can be absolutely life-changing. And taking an experience-sensitive approach. So I love Georgia Pavlopoulos' work, thinking about developing a sense of agency, emphasizing building genuine relationships with people, recognizing your uniqueness and the uniqueness of others, helping people to make sense of their own experiences, and really recognizing the togetherness can help yourself and other people on the journey that you take. So if you are interested in reading about autistic masking, this is a link to our book. You can scan the QR code and it will take you to the link on Kieran's website. It's available through Pavilion and also available through Amazon. But I am going to stop sharing the slides in a moment and have a look at this chat. But I just want to say thank you to you all for listening. And thank you to my wonderful collaborators, to Kieran, to Danielle Miller and John Rees, who were involved in that lovely project we did back in 2021. Thank you all very much. Okay. Right, and I'm also going to pop my slides out of full screen so I can see everything that's going on here. So I'm just going to scroll back through the chat, and I've gotten to the bit. So circumscribed just means like niche or restricted, so kind of a really narrow focused interest. Think of here as a marginalized awesome place. I think that's in the Wellbeing Hub. That's a place where lots of marginalized people come together, but it's lovely and that's really nice. How do you know if you are masking? I think it's a really complicated question. So one of the things that Kieran and I talk about is that when you have the energy to explore your own authenticity, starting to do that in a way that feels safe to you. So you might not be able to tell when you are masking, but you might be able to tell when you are being more authentic. What makes you feel most comfortable? What brings you sensory joy? What are your core interests? What do you enjoy doing? And starting to recognize those bits of you that are truly authentically you, the things that make you feel the best. It might not be that you can then just, take off that mask and start to live authentically all the time. It's complicated and we don't always feel safe to do that. But if you can find spaces where you can explore what really brings you joy and then develop some sense of agency around that, I think that's the place to start. Lots here scrolling back. Regarding masking and gender, is there research about autism presentation in non-cisgender people? Yes, there is. There is. And so I did some research with a wonderful student of mine a few years ago, Soph Story, and there's been an absolute slew of stuff coming out recently. John Strang does wonderful work in this area with Goldie McQuaid. Kate Cooper has also done some really nice work on this, and I have a PhD student who's looking at the experiences of autistic transgender millennials, or is going to be once his ethics is approved. But yeah, and what we see is the same as what I was saying, that we know that gender shapes experience, but it's the experience of being non-binary, of being trans, that has that interaction, those gender expectations. We also see that kind of that double pressure. So autistic people who are non-binary and trans, in the study that Soph did, they found that their participants were effectively saying, I feel like I have to mask being autistic and mask my autistic characteristics. And I also feel like I have to mask my gender identity and my gender expression. And so it's that experience of being marginalized in multiple ways, of feeling unsafe around other people in multiple ways, and feeling like you need to mask this kind of multiple aspects of yourself. That's why I think it's so important to take stigma into account. Masking isn't something that happens in a vacuum because we're autistic. It's something that happens because we're stigmatized. And we see that in other groups of stigmatized people. So trans people who aren't autistic, for instance, engage in masking and concealment. It's just slightly different to what we might see in a trans person who is also autistic. How do you unlearn masking? I think that's a question I wish I had an answer to. As I was saying before, I think exploring your own authenticity and your own autonomy and agency is one place to start. But that post-diagnostic period where you effectively unpack your entire life through a different lens is intense. I was formally diagnosed 3 years ago. It was my autism birthday on August 31st. And I still feel sometimes like I'm learning new things about myself all the time. It's a really long process, and I think people often underestimate how intense that is to go back over your entire life through a different lens, thinking about things that have happened to you, ways you've responded, learning what you do and don't like, who you are really underneath all of the mechanisms and the coping strategies that you've built up. It's really traumatic. And it's really intense, and it takes time, and you are not broken. Um, but it's a journey, to say the least. But just continue to explore what makes you happy and what makes you feel like most authentically you. A question here. I have an autistic son and an autistic daughter. My son always accessed specialist school. My daughter was in mainstream. I can absolutely see masking the effects of this in my daughter, but not in my son. It's interesting. So I also have an autistic brother who was diagnosed younger than me. We were both in mainstream school, but he was always seen as having challenging behaviour, and I was always seen as the goody two shoes. And my mum always said, we knew that you were different, but you weren't a problem, so it didn't matter. And I was like, thanks, mum. But yeah, I suspect your son probably is also masking. It just doesn't manifest in the same way as that fatigue you're seeing in your daughter. I think this is something I'd be really interested to look at in future. As I think there's sometimes not among parents necessarily, I think among professionals, that autistic people who are more visibly autistic don't mask. And it's not true. It's just that we don't necessarily pick up on those external differences as much, because we expect someone to act in an autistic manner. So it can kind of manifest in those more subtle ways. But we do all see that impact of gender as well. So she might be more prone to people pleasing, or feel like she needs to socialize more because of those expectations. Yeah, it's so complicated. How do we increase understanding of masking and its impact, particularly for parents and professionals? It feels like often the externally viewed result of masking is behaviour that is more acceptable and being more easily integrated into the neurotypical world. And so it's considered a positive thing. Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's something that, so I do a lot of sessions in schools. I've done sessions at the local council with practitioners, the NHS, as frequently as I can to try and talk about masking. I direct people to resources, to our book, to other academics' work. I think the more we talk about it and the more we get information out there into the mainstream, it's crucial that that needs to change. I think one of the problems is that, and this isn't me like, kind of talking negatively about people who do influencer work, but I think often the discussions that I had about masking on social media can be quite unnuanced or simplified. And that leads to misconceptions with, educators who might be like, well, masking is this, but it's not that. Not recognizing the complexity of, well, actually, it's anything where this person is suppressing themselves or projecting inauthenticity. But I think directing people to resources where possible. So if you know like a good website, I often direct people to Kieran's website, because he's got great resources on there, lots of recommendations again for accessible reading as well. And trying to get that as widely understood as possible, I think, is one way we can make change. But that it's also our responsibility as academics to make sure that we talk about these things in an accessible way, right? So we present our work to different public facing bodies so that it isn't just sitting in journal articles, that we're making sure that it actually reaches the people who need to know about it. There's a guide that's just come out, Unmasked by Ellie Middleton. I haven't had a chance to read that yet. There's also Hannah Belcher has written a book on masking, and that has like a workbook in around unmasking as well. So that might be useful if anyone is interested in that. And thank you, whoever had to go, but it's popping up a chat box there. Have to go. Thank you, anonymous user, for the comment, not a question. Love that. And thank you for saying it's validating. Do we all have a duty to destigmatize autism? Yes, we do all have a duty to destigmatize autism. People with power do have more of a duty than others. So people who have the power to shape the narrative need to put more effort into improving that for people. And also for taking on a little bit of the weight of that work. The less stigmatized you are, the more energy you've got, the more you should be putting into the community and helping people. I think that's really crucial. Focusing on what makes you feel better and makes you thrive. That's what we all want in life, right? It's to thrive. Thank you, Laura. That's it. This is a great comment here of my young person is sick of me asking how they are because I'm finding it hard to know how they are. Perhaps it's masking, but a teenage young man, it's so hard. So instead of asking someone how they're feeling or how they are, you might ask them things like, how are things going at the moment? Or tell me about a specific thing. Like use more specific questions. One of the things that really helped me, so I'm alexithymic, and I have worked really hard over the past couple of years. I had amazing therapy, and I've worked really hard to try and get better at recognizing my own emotions. And it's not like I suddenly recognize the feelings inside of my body more effectively. It's that I now have the ability to be like, oh, when things start to be like this, that's usually an indicator of this is going on. And so helping him to start seeing those links, like you seem like you might be a little bit stressed at the moment, and you're usually stressed when this is going on, might help him to start recognize that. Like he might get a little bit better at recognizing it, but it's a lot of work, especially for a teenager. Teenagers have complicated feelings anyway, and often don't really know what's going on because there's so much going on in there. It's really intense for them. It's some of that's probably alexithymia, and some of that's probably just being a teenage boy. As someone working in the therapy space, how could a therapist working with an autistic person support them to unmask? No, I think it's the same kind of thing I was saying before. So help them to explore their authentic selves, help them to explore what makes them feel safe, what makes them feel comfortable, what kinds of access needs that they have. Like just recognizing your own adjustments that you need to make something more accessible for you is a way of unmasking a little bit. Helping someone explore that most authentic version of them. And it might be that's not just one thing, but it might be helping someone find interests that bring them joy and finding community that's supportive of them, recognizing their own needs. What is it like to be autistic in academia? It's interesting. So I love being an academic. I love my work. I love my job, and I love research. I'm really curious, and I'm a really nosy person, by nature. But it can also be inaccessible for a lot of people. I'm really lucky in that in the job that I have, in the place that I work, you know, I have my own office. It's nice and quiet. I have my own space. If I need something, I just can ask for it. In my previous job, that wasn't the case. I had to work in a very busy, hot office, and I wasn't in the office a lot of the time because of that. The other thing that's really complicated, as I was saying, like working in autism research specifically, you can get into that bubble where you're surrounded by wonderful people doing wonderful work. And then occasionally you'll encounter someone who's really dehumanizing. And they'll be like, oh, but we don't mean you, not autistic people like you know, autistic people like, and you're like, but who do you mean? Like, say what you mean there. Because autistic people are like me and I am like other autistic people. You can't separate us out. Um, and it's important for adults to identify their autism identity. For some people, it's really important. You don't necessarily need a formal diagnosis to explore your identity. For some people, it gives them an explanation and a way to understand their experiences. It allows people to find community. It isn't a cure-all. It's not a panacea, but understanding who you are and how you process information can open up a lot of doors to understanding yourself. Um, and for a lot of people, that information can be life-changing, but it's not something that you need to have a diagnosis to explore. Anyone can start to explore their sensory needs, or how they communicate with other people and learn a lot about themselves in the process, I think. Got a really lovely question here about how do we create safe spaces for people to process their own identity and positively influence by enabling the celebration of authenticity? That is an absolutely wonderful question. I think that I mean the question, the answer's kind of in the question there, which is we create the safe spaces. So we create pockets of community, whether that's in person, whether that's online. We create places where people can explore that. And actually, I was reading an interview today. I was quoting some data, and I was reading an interview from a participant, and it wasn't an autistic participant, or it wasn't someone who has a diagnosis of autism. It's someone who has lived their life as a neurotypical person, ostensibly. But he was talking about creating community, and he was saying, you know, I had lots of interests throughout my life. I was part of a weightlifting club and boxing. I've done this, I've done that. But there wasn't much where I lived, so I set this up and I invited people to come, and there would be young people there who I could see were on the margins, so I would invite them in. Why don't you come and do this with us in this specific group, and introduce them to people and help them create their own communities, and then they'd build up other groups and invite people in. And he talked about that process of it being an active thing that you have to do. You can't just kind of have a space and then, like, you know, build it and they will come. You've got to work to create that and make it feel safe for people by creating that sense of belonging. And I think creating spaces where people can meet other autistic people, is crucial. Like I do talks at colleges, and I'll get, you know, 16, 18-year-olds coming up to me being like, I've never met an autistic person before. And I'm like, you have met autistic people, you've just never met an autistic adult who's out. And I think that that's a little bit sad, really, that people have gotten to almost adulthood and they've never met other people who they think are like them. So I think creating those spaces, say whether it's physical or online, and then scaffolding that where people can explore themselves and other people is yeah, it's one way forward. Community is really important for many of us. What do you think about culture and the influence on masking? It's easy to be myself in more direct cultures. This comes up in research all the time, and it's something, again, I've seen in the interviews that I've been coding. Lots of people talk about living abroad in places where the communication is different, and that actually sometimes as well, when you're living in a different country, people will just put you being different down to you being foreign. And so it's almost like you're masking through that cultural difference. But there's definitely a cultural influence. There's some really nice research coming out of Japan at the moment showing that the experience of masking over there is very much influenced also by those cultural norms and expectations that are placed on people regarding things like politeness and social niceties. And so, yeah, all of that masking is shaped by our cultural experiences, very much so. Your Kieran's website. What suggestions do you have for adult women who have been self-identified in their 60s? I would recommend trying to read things from other late diagnosed autistic women. Cos Michaels does some great work, and there's Art Angel that I think Cos has spoken at, run a group for people who are diagnosed later in life. They've got like a group for older autistic adults. And there are lots of resources out there written by wonderful autistic people, that I think actually probably will help you feel like you've got sometimes it's just the validation and resonance that comes from reading about similar experiences to your own. So yeah, hopefully that'll be useful. What are your thoughts on autistic people who've been brought up in undiagnosed neurodivergent homes by parents who didn't know they were ND, and how that impacts masking? I'm a parent to two teenage ADHDers and just diagnosed autistic at ADHD of 51, probably also autistic. And I feel like I taught my kids to mask without knowing it. I think that's probably a very common experience among many people. Something that Kieran and I have talked about at length, and we talk about in the book, that there are many people who do teach their kids to mask because that's what's kept them safe as they have been growing up, and they want to keep their kids safe. And I think it's really important that we don't blame parents for that or shame them, because you're doing what has helped you to survive. I think that there are a lot of people who, when their kids get diagnosed, also often get diagnosed themselves, or start to realize things about themselves. When I was filling in my own information for the diagnostic pathway, I was going through the developmental questionnaire with my mum, and I was like, there's a question on here like, how would your daughter respond if unfamiliar or unexpected people came to the house? And she's like, but no one would ever come to the house unexpected. If someone knocked on the door and we weren't expecting them, we would hide. And I was like, okay, mum, like that's, yeah. Can you write that verbatim for the clinician, please, so that they can see that? You know, you learn through your environment as well as, through your genetics. Yeah, I think it's a process for all of us. And as we gain more information and things start to change, parents have that self-insight at an earlier point. We have better support for kids and their families. Maybe that'll change. But I also think you shouldn't feel guilty about having done something that has helped you and your children to survive. I think that's really important to recognize. Got a comment, not a question. Da-da-da. Yeah, just infuriating things about people making comments about what autism does and doesn't look like. Yeah, absolutely infuriating. Oh, that's a really good question. Yeah, about autism and eating disorders. I mean, it might, and this is, I'm not a clinician, but it might be that some of the difficulties that she was experiencing were amplified by the fact that she was also particularly unwell. So I know for me personally that so eating, for example, like if I'm really highly stressed, my sensory responses to food are really different. And so like I usually call it like I can judge how stressed I am by the kind of egg I can eat, right? So like if I can eat a fried egg, I know that life is pretty good. Whereas like if my tolerance for eggs is like it can only be scrambled and only in this exact way that I will do it myself, then I'm probably not so good. And my diet tends to become more and more restricted to a smaller number of foods the more highly stressed I am, because it's almost like I can't deal with that. And I find the less stressed I am generally, or the less ill I am, my anxiety is lower, my sensory sensitivity is lower, and reactivity is lower. I stim less or stim visibly less because I'm more comfortable. So I don't think it necessarily means that she's masking all the time. It might just be that less is going on, so she has more space within her own mind. But it's also worth, if you can have those kind of open conversations with her and say like, hey, I've noticed these things and I just want you to know, like, if there's anything we can do to make you feel more comfortable, or if you're not comfortable, try and broach that in a really sensitive way. But it literally might just be that she's not as distressed as she was then. And so those things aren't happening because that distress level isn't there to cause them. A lot of the things that we think of as kind of like key autistic traits, like stimming, like I stim all the time. I've got a pen in my hand, but the kind of stimming I do when I'm distressed and the stimming I do just generally are very different. And I think we often kind of think of that distress stimming as being an autistic characteristic when often it's a distress characteristic, if that makes sense. Do you think a lot of the self-understanding comes with age? Yeah, I do. I do think it comes with age. Not just like for me, but from the interviews I've been reading recently, the interviews with older people are just stunning in their richness and the way that people reflect on themselves, like, and the recognition of how their lives have changed them is really beautiful. I think that it also comes with self-reflection and spending a lot of time unpacking your understanding of yourself, not to the point of rumination, but trying to work out who you are and again what makes you genuinely happy, what makes you genuinely comfortable. Something I keep seeing a lot in the interviews that I'm going through at the moment is life is too short. People keep saying, life is too short not to do this, life's too short not to do the things that you're passionate about or do the things that interest you. And so, yeah, I think sometimes age can bring that comfort of starting to care just a little bit less what other people think. Um, would you
Amy,
mind sharing yeah?
sorry.
We've got 4
Just to,
minutes.
yeah, I just wanted to give you a little time check, and just to say that if we could wrap up with a final question from me, just that would be lovely. So maybe just one more question from the audience. Is that okay?
Yeah, so I'll do the one about Jenny's diagnosis, but I will say very quickly that yes, misdiagnosis is very common among autistic people conflating with borderline. Very, very common misdiagnosis. Um, I so I've talked very openly about my diagnostic process, and there are videos online of this, but the very short answer to that is that I knew that I was different to lots of other people. I struggled at school. I was bullied. I had a lot of mental health issues, and I hid them very expertly until I was at university, and I got really mentally unwell when I was in my final year. I managed to just get through that. And then decided to do a PhD, like that would be the best thing for my mental health. And I held it together okay. And then when I got a job after I finished my PhD, I had a really busy job, lots of work, and I got really burnt out. And everything that I had built up in terms of coping mechanisms went out the window. I couldn't go to the supermarket because it was too loud, it was too bright. I couldn't talk properly. I was falling over all the time. Like all of these problems just emerged. And I thought the best way to deal with that would probably be going to see a counsellor. Um, my brother was autistic, and there was always a little bit of a thing in the back of my head being like, um, but I went for counselling, and my counsellor was like, this is obviously all interesting and all, but also there's something going on here. You've got an interesting neurotype, and then after a few sessions, like, I'm pretty sure you're autistic. And then I met Kieran, and I met Kieran and walked into a cafe with him, and he said, "So you're autistic, aren't you?" And I was like, "Apparently so." So I referred myself for a diagnostic assessment. And as I went through that, it was during COVID, and I had lots of time by myself to reflect. I had lots of time away from the bustle of everything, which gave some good time to recovery for burnout. And yeah, and by the time I was formally diagnosed, I almost found that that stamp of approval wasn't important anymore because I'd found community, knew a bit more about myself, and was starting to get quite comfortable with who I am. And I'll leave it there, but yeah, if you're more interested, there are various things out there where I waffle on about that sort of thing. But thank you all so much for listening to me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that was just such a fantastic mix of research excellence and heartfelt lived experience. Really powerful talk. Thank you so much, Amy. I'm sure I speak for everyone tonight when I say that. Just very, very quickly before we wrap up, every month I ask our speakers the same question to wrap up the evening's talk, and that is, of all the amazing things you've talked about this evening, if there was just one thing you'd like us all to go away with tonight, what would it be?
Be kinder to yourselves. I think that is the takeaway, and be kinder to other people, but explore what brings you joy and what makes you personally thrive. And that is the best way to live an authentic life.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, everyone who's joined us this evening. I hope you have a lovely evening and hope to see you again next month for Al's talk. Watch out for the newsletter with a link so that you can register for that. But thank you so much. Take care.
Cool. Bye.
Bye, Amy. Thank you.
Bye.